So in this unit, we're going to go through a few different topics. We're going to start just talking about cells and how cells divide and the process when one cell reproduces to form more cells. And then we're going to start to talk about how organisms reproduce and talk about human reproduction as well. And then after that, we're going to start to talk about genetics, how traits get passed on from one generation to another. So we got sort of several sections that come along with this unit. So we're going to start today and for the next couple of days focusing on something that's called mitosis. Mitosis is a type of cell reproduction. And it's when cells reproduce or make a copy of themselves for different reasons. And this is the one you told me, Isaiah, right? To replace old cells. When cells stop working, new cells need to replace them. So those new cells are made through this process that we're going to learn about that's called mitosis. Also, to grow new cells or for an organism to grow larger, new cells are needed. And also, in some organisms, they reproduce by mitosis. Like a bacteria, a single-celled bacteria reproduces by just making a copy of itself. And then you have two bacteria. So normally our cells in our body, they reproduce when new cells are needed and then they stop. But there are times when that doesn't happen correctly. And that's what cancer is. So when we think about what cancer is our own body cells that are reproducing when they shouldn't and making copies of themselves and forming what we call tumors. And normally cells stop reproducing once they have replaced the other cells, but sometimes they lose that, and that's what leads to cancer. Our own body cells making these masses we call tumors. Because there's normally this thing called the cell cycle, this process that makes sure the cell only reproduces when necessary. And so this is a diagram that shows what happens during the cell cycle. And there's like checks where the cell sort of checks in with itself, says, okay, is everything okay? Then I can move on. Are new cells needed? Then it goes into the mitosis phase. So we're going to learn about mitosis. And we're going to learn about the steps that allows it to happen. But in order for us to understand it, we have to know about chromosomes. Remember what chromosomes are or where they're found in the cell? They're in the nucleus. So remember, in our cells, there's the nucleus, which has in it our DNA, our genetic materials in the nucleus. And it's stored in these little kind of packages called chromosomes. And it's a mixture of some protein, and then the DNA is kind of wrapped around the protein. And that's where our genetic information is. The information that makes us who we are, it's stored in our cells in the chromosomes. So depending on when you are looking at the cell, sometimes the chromosomes look like little X's. Other times it might be split off, and they look like single halves of the X's. So for example, here is one chromosome. Right? It's got two sides. They're held together with a little section called the centromere. And these two halves of the chromosome are identical to each other. Okay? These two halves of the chromosome came because one side copied itself to make the other side. Those are called chromatids, sister chromatids. They're identical to each other. Chromosomes also come in pairs. They come in sort of partners that are not necessarily identical. We call those homologous chromosomes, right? They're partners. So they have genes for the same traits. For example, here on this chromosome, maybe there's a gene for your eye color, right? And maybe over here is also a gene for eye color. One of these chromosomes in each pair came from a person's mother and a person's father. That's where we get our chromosomes. We inherit them from our parents. Half of the chromosomes I have came from my mother, the other half came from my father. That's how reproduction works in humans. You get half of your genetics from each parent. Now, in humans, the typical number of chromosomes that our cells have is 46. Okay? In a healthy human cell, there should be 46 chromosomes inside each nucleus of our cells. 23 pairs. 23 that came from my mother, 23 came from my father. That's what's in every cell in my body for 46 altogether. That's called the diploid number sometimes, that total number of chromosomes. And so we could see here what the chromosomes look like. And humans have 46. That's our normal diploid number in healthy cells. Other species have different numbers of chromosomes. A monkey, for example, has 28 chromosomes total. A horse has 66. A housefly has 22. A rabbit, 44. The number doesn't really mean anything. It doesn't mean like something's bigger or more smarter or more advanced. It just is kind of a number that has evolved over time. Do you have a question? That's okay. All right. So in order for one cell to make an exact copy of itself, there's an organized process that happens. And we call that process mitosis. We're going to learn about each. We often split it into different steps, and we'll talk about those steps. They're called phases: prophase, metaphase, anaphase, and telophase. And we'll look at what happens in each step. So the first part, when a cell is just kind of doing its thing, living its life, providing its function, that's called interphase. It's kind of in between. It's resting. It's doing its job. And when we look at cells like under the microscope, you look at your cheek cells, for example, what you're seeing probably were cells that were in this interphase. They were just doing their job. But when it's time for the cell to copy itself, when it's time for the cell to reproduce, some things start to happen. The first thing is the chromosomes copy themselves. They replicate. They go from one line to that X shape because they've copied to the other half. That's the first part before the cell can divide. Because if you're going to have two cells with full copies of all of the genetic material, all of the DNA, first you have to copy it. Just like if you wanted to make a copy of your note packet, you'd have to copy the individual pages and then separate them into two note packets. That's what's happening in the cell. So once the DNA has copied itself, what happens is the chromosomes start to form and they start to become visible in a microscope. Also, the nucleus disappears. The membrane that forms the nucleus, it starts to dissolve so that the chromosomes can start to move. And you can see them. This is what it looks like in a microscope. You can see this purple stuff. Those are the chromosomes. They've condensed. They're visible. You can see in this cell, there's no membrane around the nucleus. It's disappeared. That's what happens in prophase. Also, these fibers start to form. Okay, they act almost like ropes that are going to separate these chromosomes. So the phase, that's prophase. Then we move to metaphase. In metaphase, the chromosomes all line up in the middle of the cell. You can remember metaphase, middle. They line in the middle. We call that the equator of the cell, just like we have an equator on the planet, divides the planet in half. So these chromosomes line up right along the middle of the cell. And here in the microscope, we can see they're all in a line. They're attached by these spindle fibers, these sort of ropes. That's metaphase. The chromosomes are in the middle. Then we have anaphase. The chromosomes that were lined up in the middle, they split in half and they start moving apart from each other. They get pulled apart. And they're moving to opposite ends of the cell. You can see that in this microscope image. The chromosomes are going to be pulled out to each end of the cell. If we go back here, notice in metaphase, they were shaped, they're X's, right? And then in anaphase, the X splits up and they get pulled apart from each other. And they get pulled all the way apart until they're in opposite ends of the cell. And then telophase happens. A new nucleus forms around each of them. And the cell starts to split in half because it's on its way to becoming two cells. And the process when the actual cell itself splits is called cytokinesis, the splitting of the cell. And then eventually the cell in animal cells, it happens a little differently in animal and plant cells. In animal cells, the cell just kind of pinches in the middle and splits in two. You could see that here. It's condensing in the middle and it gets splits, and now we have two cells at the end. In plant cells, it happens a little differently. In plant cells, once the chromosomes have replicated and been pulled to opposite sides of the cell, a new cell wall starts forming in between and eventually splits it into two separate cells. Let's go back here for a second. Let's just look at this. Okay. This is our original cell. How many chromosomes are there in here, Isaiah? 4 chromosomes, right? There's an orange one, a blue one, a red one, and a purple one. Okay, so that's prophase. Those 4 chromosomes, they're still here, right? They all line up during metaphase. Then they get split, and they're getting pulled to opposite ends of the cell in anaphase. Yeah. But really, this orange, this half, and this, they're the same. They're copies. Because remember, way back in interphase, this copied itself. So really, these are identical to each other. So each cell that we end up with here, they have the same chromosomes. Because this is a copy of this. This is a copy of this, and so forth. So once the cell forms, again, how many chromosomes are going to be in this one? And how many in this one? Yeah, and after the cell splits, they're each going to have 4 chromosomes, which is what we started with. So these cells are just basically copies of the first cell that we started with. We look at sort of an overview again, showing the same thing just in a little bit different way. We start off on interphase. The chromosomes copy, the DNA copies during interphase. Then in prophase, the DNA condenses into chromosomes. Then they line up in the middle of the cell. Then they get pulled apart from each other in anaphase. Then the cell starts to split, and eventually we have two cells. But the two cells are identical. Genetically, they're identical to the cell we started with. And that's what mitosis is, taking a cell and making two identical cells from it.